Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Bob Rohrlack. I am the President and CEO here at the Tampa Bay Chamber. Thank you for joining us for this important webinar where we are going to be talking about the COVID-19 stimulus package and understanding what it means to the community, both legally and financially. Thank you for being here. We know this is a stressful time and a different time for all of us to be operating in. It's important that we all keep working for ways we can be fully functional in our organizations with the restrictions that we're coming through, and as we're living with this different reality we have going on right now. We have some very helpful panelists that will be speaking with us today, talking about the different options. I'm going to introduce each of them, and then we will get to the questions. Today, and also before I introduce our panelists, I want to thank the fellow chamber and business organizations that we work with to make this a successful event. They are the Greater Brandon Chamber, the Greater Plant City Chamber, the Greater Riverview Chamber, the Indo-US Chamber, the North Tampa Bay Chamber, the South Tampa Chamber, the Tampa Bay EDC, the Tampa Bay LGBT Chamber, the Tampa Downtown Partnership, the Uptown Chamber, the West Shore Alliance, and the Ybor Chamber. Thank you to all of our partners that work very closely together to make Tampa Bay a successful region for people to work and succeed and to live. Now on to our panelists. Today we have four panelists that I'd like to introduce. The first is Steve Bernstein. Steve is the managing partner at Fisher Phillips Tampa office and the co-chair of the firm's labor relations practice group. Steve maintains a traditional labor practice in which he represents employers throughout the United States in both state and federal courts, as well as before the National Labor Relations Board, the U.S. Department of Labor, and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and other state and federal agencies. Next is David Jolly. David is the Executive Vice President of Shumaker Advisors, Florida, a public affairs and government relations firm affiliated with Shumaker, Loop, and Kendrick, LLP. Jolly previously served in the U.S. House of Representatives from 2014 to 2017, representing Florida's 13th Congressional District. He's a student of the institution. Jolly has held virtually every position in Congress from intern to member, and he has worked outside the Congress as an attorney and political consultant, as well as in specialty finance. Next up is Bill Goede. Bill is Bank of America's Tampa Bay Market President, and he is also the Business Banking Market Executive for the Greater Tampa Bay market. In the Tampa Bay community, Bill serves locally on the Board of Trustees for the Strass Center of the Performing Arts, Homeless Empowerment Program, the Tampa Bay Chamber, the University of Tampa, and Starting Right Now. Last but certainly not least is Rita Lowman. Rita Lowman is the president of Pilot Bank, and she is a 40-plus year banker who has blazed trails in the industry throughout her career. Her career highlights include managing 22 acquisitions in her career, including the Nations Bank Barnett acquisitions in 1997. Rita also served Nations Bank, Bank of America as the state administration executive. She also played an integral part as COO of C1 Bank, as the company went public in 2014 and selling to Bank of the Ozarks in 2015. Rita also serves on the Community Council and Government Relations of the American Bankers Association. Obviously, we have a lot of experience and knowledge working with us here today. So thank you, panelists, for all of you being here with us. Now let's get straight into the questions. Who is eligible for the small business loans? And Steve, let's throw that first question to you.
Sure, thanks, Bob. Yeah, it's important to emphasize the word small with regard to what we're talking about here. You were looking at over $1/3 trillion potentially of loan money available to those businesses with 500 or fewer employees. Employees under their standard are full or part-time, or those on another basis, but I would not include those on a 1099 status. There's an exception for those in the hospitality industry who may have more than 500 total, but no more than that figure at any single physical location. And to get a sense of how broad that group can be. We're also talking about 501c3 nonprofits, veteran organizations, tribal businesses, and even to some extent, individual single employer businesses and contractors.
Yeah, this is a very complex bit of legislation. Over 800 pages in the legislation that passed in Congress last week. The financial community and the legal community are working feverishly to understand all of the aspects. Legislation gets passed, and then the process for how that legislation is implemented takes place. That's what's going on now. And this panel is here to help us understand the latest of what's happening today. There are many agencies in the federal government and implementing down to the state governments and some community governments that are all being impacted and wanting to understand what their role and their process is. So as we go through these questions, this is the latest we know of today, and we encourage everybody, take notes, keep digging, and make sure you're doing your part to be prepared as these programs go forward. So our next question for David Jolly, how would you describe the policy goals of the recent federal COVID-19 relief measures?
Well, thank you, Bob. I appreciate that. And to your last point, I think you're exactly right. A lot of people have not perhaps ever engaged with the Small Business Administration, but because of this bill, you should. And I appreciate you getting us all together for this. The policy perspective on this is more of a relief bill, not a stimulus bill. And clearly by today's unemployment numbers and those of last week, the message is they're trying to sustain employment as much as they can. This is not a jobs growth bill per se. I kind of list out about 5 different policy goals of this legislation, and you can view a lot of the new either loan products or other products available to your industry through those goals. First and foremost is employment retention. The administration and the Congress worked hard to try to sustain employment as best as they could in this environment. And that is why they created what is a very generous paycheck protection program within the Small Business Administration, which essentially provides employers with 8 weeks of wages covered by the Small Business Administration through a forgivable loan mechanism that I'm sure we'll discuss in greater detail. They also expanded or made more generous the Small Business Administration's economic injury disaster loans available for employers of less than 500. They also, for any business that suffered disruption, provided a $5,000 tax credit per employer. Now that's for a qualifying business that can demonstrate they suffered disruption because of closures or because of a loss of 50% of revenue. As many of you may have experienced, they expanded FMLA through an employer tax credit. They've deferred employer tax payments that may be due for Social Security and so forth. All of those were in the employment retention bucket, try to keep Americans employed and try to keep employers not just responsible for keeping people employed, but make it more feasible for them to keep employees on the payroll during this time. The second policy goal is an individual basic income goal. That is, you can think of the direct U.S. government payment to individuals of $1,200 or couples for $2,400. The expanded unemployment or unemployment insurance benefits. If you have employees that have had to separate or have had to investigate unemployment insurance, while it does not fully replace their income, it is far more generous than it used to. Florida had a cap around $275 per week prior to this bill. This bill provides an additional $600 per week. So you can see a factor of 3x in unemployment insurance for those newly unemployed individuals. They also provided provisions suspending foreclosure on some loans, made some fixes to student loan reimbursements between employer and employees, all focused on individual basic income. The remaining 3 goals are industry sustainment. You've probably seen news around the new funds available for airlines, some of the relaxed standards around financial services, other products for distressed businesses. Importantly, they provided money to back up the Fed. You know, as a Morgan Stanley executive told me last week, the Fed has done more in 2 weeks than they did in an entire year around the 2008 crisis. But the Fed can't lose money statutorily, so Congress is backing up the Fed as the Fed lets out some of these more generous products. The fourth one was a public health policy goal, making sure that COVID testing and vaccines, should they become available, are fully covered for individuals, additional money for research, change some rules around the FDA's over-the-counter protocols, also expanded telehealth. And the final one is backing up state and municipal governments who have had to absorb additional COVID response expenses, as we've seen states have to bear the brunt of the response. Congress wanted to try to back them up as well. It's the largest relief bill we have ever seen from the Congress, and that is reflected in all of these policy goals that they tried to achieve. Again, not in the lane of stimulus. They're not expecting job creation. This is more relief for employers and employees and trying to sustain the employment numbers as best as they can in this environment.
Good, thank you, David. And as we go through these questions and talk about all this information, please go to tampabaychamber.com for links for more information, or one of our partner organizations' website for information, but tampabaychamber.com will have links for information. Our next question, Steve, what is the criteria for forgiveness from one of these loans?
Well, thanks, Bob. Yeah, to get into that, it's worth touching on a concept David just mentioned, and which I suspect we'll hear more about, particularly from the banking side from Rita and Bill, but that is the notion of essentially a paycheck protection program. It's not a concept many of us have heard before, but as David suggested, it's really designed to incentivize small businesses to retain workers during this challenging time and to refrain from cutting their pay, which of course is going to be a move that many small businesses really feel highly motivated to move towards during these challenging times, and many have already gone there. But the bottom line is this: you need to answer that question, you first need to look at how much money is available to small business under that program. And there is a formula, and this stuff can get technical pretty quickly, but the best way to simplify it for our purposes is to basically say that they're going to look at your average monthly payroll costs over the year preceding the origination of your loan. And once you arrive at an average monthly payroll figure, you can multiply that by 2.5 to arrive at basically the max loan that you're able to obtain. And then you basically will have an opportunity to take that loan up to $10 million. So it's $10 million or 2.5 times your average monthly payroll costs, whichever is less. And then think about what kind of money that can bring to your organization when you realize there is forgiveness built into it. And the forgiveness is basically determined by reviewing the payments you made on a series of items, primarily payroll costs, but also interest on secured debts, rent, utilities, similar expenses. How did you pay that out over an 8-week period? And that aggregate figure will be the forgiveness figure. So it's a long way of saying that the government is interested basically in providing you with loan relief for essentially 10 weeks of your payroll, and then examining what you pay it out over the 8 weeks after your loan. And for those of you who are in the HR field or working with those who are in your businesses, think about, begin thinking about the documents you'd need to retain to make those established evidentiary requirements that Bill and Rita may be covering later. It is not too early to start thinking about how you would capture that information by reference to your payroll and so forth. And I know we'll get into forgiveness in more detail shortly, but that gives you a sense of how big this figure is. For lack of a better word, many of my clients view this as free money, because there's really no other way to put it. If you operate the way the government wants you to, by essentially retaining, or if you've laid off, bringing back workers over a period of time following the loan, or if you've cut wages, restoring them, you're acting the way government wants you to act as a small business, and you'll be rewarded in the form of full loan forgiveness potentially.
So is someone able to take advantage of the PPP loan and the payroll tax deferral, or is it a one or the other?
That might be a better question for one of our other folks. I'll
Sure,
let them
okay.
take a stab at that.
Bob, this is David, and
Yes.
using your caveat at the beginning that this is still, we're a week into this and it's 800 pages, on the payroll tax deferral, I have not seen any language that disqualifies one from the other. Where you see some rules around qualifying are between small business administration competing products, like if you are applying for an economic injury disaster loan and a paycheck protection program, you have to certify they're not for the same, to cover the same expenses. There are also some rules that may allow you to roll one loan into another. We're acting on guidance at this point. We don't have the final rules. It's a great question, but the payroll tax deferral appears in a totally separate section than the Small Business Administration loan programs.
So I think the counsel would be that everyone cannot tap into every single program that's being made available, and the best way is be strategic on what's the best system or process for your particular business. So seek counsel before you act would be our takeaway. So David, are there any provisions that jump out to you that a majority of our members should make sure they are aware of with this new legislation?
Yeah, there sure are, and it's in the universe of what we're talking about. And I want to lean into your last comment about seeking counsel, because each provision does come with very specific implementation guidance. The payroll tax deferral that we just mentioned, for instance, allows you to postpone into the next 2 taxable years your payroll tax obligation. It doesn't forgive it. And so that's obviously something you would need to contemplate as a business owner. The other thing, and Steve just alluded to this, as you investigate these new programs, and Steve used the term free money, and it does sound a little too callous to use it, but truly, if you have a business under 500 people, you likely qualify to apply for this Small Business Administration Paycheck Protection Program and then turn around and have the next 8 weeks of your payroll forgiven. You should investigate it. But I will caveat, very important, and we're dealing with this right now with one of my personal clients at Shumaker Advisors. There are specific language. If you have already laid off or furloughed employees, you do have to make that employment load number whole again at your business to be eligible for some of these programs. Now, they allow you a grace period to do that, and this is where the specifics of the law become very important. So, look, what provisions should the Tampa Chamber and affiliated members definitely be looking at? The heart of this bill that everybody's going to be looking at from a business perspective is the Small Business Administration Paycheck Protection Program. Without question, that's absolutely where you should be looking. The Small Business Administration actually has it at the very top of their page, a link to say, apply here, here's more information. But I would also say whatever business that you're in, and even over 500, there are qualifying incentives. As I mentioned, that $5,000 tax credit per employer if you suffered business disruption. If you're a business that we're told to close, the language of the bill says if you had to close because of a government order, you qualified for this. Or if you can demonstrate your revenue dropped, perhaps you're in a hospitality industry and a small business and your revenue dropped, you can apply for the per employee credit of $5,000. And then I would also say for Tampa Chamber members who I know take responsibility and have personal relationships with their employees, there are generous benefits for your employees even if they have to separate. And that is also something you can play a role counseling separated employees on some of the new benefits that they might find as well under this bill. It is not going to fully get us out of this current environment. But just because this current environment seems daunting right now, I would say don't overlook what is in this bill, because there likely is a provision that applies to you. And if there's not, there's probably more legislation coming.
Good counsel. Thank you. Steve, this is somewhat of a technical question. Can the amount eligible for forgiveness be reduced if the company engages in layoffs and/or reduces compensation? If so, what is the criteria for the reduction?
Well, yeah, let's try to walk through that as a group. And I, again, giving David credit because he teed this one up nicely. But let me start by saying that big picture here, the amount of loan forgiveness is essentially equal to the sum of the borrower's payroll costs that are incurred during the 8-week period following loan origination, compared to a benchmark. And this is where it gets a little technical over the preceding year. And so there's a little math from the standpoint of evaluating proportions. Proportion of your payroll costs over the 8 weeks after the loan relative to one of two periods. And these two periods essentially are applied depending upon when your business came into existence. So the first benchmark is going to look at your average number of full-time employees per month from the period February 15, 2019 through June 30th, 2019. But of course, SBA and other agencies recognize that a lot of borrowers didn't come in existence until then. And essentially, so long as you formed your business by February of this year, you still may qualify for the loan. And if it was after the first benchmark, they're going to look at your average number of employees during a period beginning January of this year and running through the end of February this year. But that's the math of this. The reality is, when you get down to slicing it up, they're interested in maintaining the incentives we discussed earlier. And that means not just examining total payroll and how you're maintaining your payroll, but also the extent to which you're reducing wages. And so they're going to look at that from the standpoint of payroll costs. And if you reduce salary or wages paid to employees by more than 25% during the most recent quarter in which an employee was employed, that is going to basically amount as a percentage deduct against your overall forgiveness. And so they're monitoring total payroll, but they're also monitoring what you spend on that total payroll. And as David also alluded to, it is not too late for businesses that may have already cut, because this stimulus incentive moves very hard at encouraging you all to reemploy those folks as soon as you reasonably can. And you will be credited if you begin to employ those folks during the 8-week period following loan origination. So again, there's a lot of incentive to do that. The last thing I'll say, though, is even in your worst case scenario, where large portions of this loan are not forgiven, they're charged at, as I understand it, 4% interest payable over upwards of 10 years. And so, I've tried to walk a lot of small businesses through this, not as a banker or even a financial or tax lawyer, but as an operations type of perspective. And for those who are teetering on the edge right now, and a lot of businesses are hurting, they really have every incentive to investigate this carefully, because in a worst case scenario, there's still a lot of relief potentially coming to them just through this portion of the program alone.
Good, thank you. Steve, in reference to the time period for the payroll review, can you give that time period again to make sure everybody gets that right?
Sure. So again, there's the first period of review, and the 8-week period you're going to hear a lot about is an 8-week period that runs from the time you've originated the loan going forward. And your payroll is going to be closely crunched over that period against an average monthly payroll. And then the question defaults to, well, when do they measure your average monthly payroll to see if you've maintained it? And the answer to that question turns on one of two periods that are very different. The first period runs from 2/15/19 to 6/30/19, which is kind of an odd 4.5 month period from last year. And don't ask me how they arrived at that, because I don't know. But for those businesses that may not have been operating at the time, they do have the option of adopting a more recent average monthly payroll that would run from January 1 of this year through February 29 of this year.
Okay, so there are different timeframes that come into play on how they're looking at it. So again, make sure you're seeking that legal counsel as you go through these programs. It's going to get complicated to know which hoops to jump through at the right time. Thank you for that, Steve. Next question for David. We're already hearing in Congress, they're talking about the next stimulus bill to come through. What's the latest you're hearing that might be coming from Congress and as they're looking at this?
Sure. So we may see two bills come through, and if history is a guide, the first bill we may see would be a fix, and you see that after major legislation where simply there are some technical aspects that are wrong. I see there's a question in the forum about applying for multiple small business administration loans. That's an area right now where we have a client with a pending loan for an economic injury disaster loan. And so they can't rightly make the certification for the Paycheck Protection Program that they haven't applied for other funds. The spirit of the law is such that they want that employer to be able to tap the Paycheck Protection Program. It may be a fix is needed in that area. We've also come in contact with some of the providers in the nonprofit world that, though many are rolled into some of these provisions, there are some nonprofits that have been left out. The first piece of major legislation I think we would see next would be a fix to this bill, and it's really a question of scope. How much does it try to fix? But then I would anticipate you will see try to originate in the House, because the way this came about largely was through negotiation with the White House and the Senate, and the House felt a little left out. They cooperated because they needed to, and they were in communication with the Senate, but the House did not have many of their priorities included. You will see them the House originate likely another bill, and this one may be focused at job creation, at stimulus. That when we get to midsummer, you may see, given the unemployment numbers in the U.S., that Congress moves on a major jobs bill as kind of the second part to this relief bill. It could take the form of infrastructure. We've seen some talk around an infrastructure bill. You may see some trade provisions that try to energize domestic industry, some tax provisions in particular that specifically get to either onshoring U.S. jobs or creating more U.S. jobs. What we are seeing politically is the GOP is kind of in a wait and see mode. Let's just see what this $2 trillion does. But the House, particularly House Democrats, are already beginning to plan for a jobs bill. This environment is shifting by the day, Bob.
Right,
and so what will the politics of all this look like in midsummer is very hard to predict, but we do anticipate there will be 1 to 2 bills to move probably in the next 12 weeks.
Okay, so everybody definitely keep an eye on that. Steve, our next question, does the loan cover leave paid under the EPSL and the EFMLA requirements?
Yeah, Bob, I imagine if our listeners aren't getting tired and just inundated with the acronyms yet, they will be by the time this is over.
Yeah.
There's so much to absorb, and the world looked very different, I think, particularly for us employment lawyers just a week ago before this came down. It's hard to believe, David, what's it been? It's been 7 days since Bill,
Right.
800 pages and 7 days later. But before that universe, most of you on the line who were at 500 or fewer were already grappling with other federal laws. Emergency paid sick leave is that first acronym. Emergency family medical leave is the second. And we won't get into all the details here, but understand that, effective yesterday, April 1, those laws have been in effect, and they now integrate, not always seamlessly, with the local and state shutdown orders. But they're designed, obviously, to infuse paid leave to those who are impacted by the COVID-19 crisis in different ways. And the key to remember there is, to the extent you're paying those out, those already qualify, those payments, for relief by virtue of the tax credit system, which for most of you will be done on a quarterly basis. And because you qualify for relief already through that element of the program, you don't qualify for relief from payments made with regard to the loan piece of this. So yes, there's reimbursement available, but the mechanism for delivering it is different than the loan program.
Okay, good. And our banking experts have been very patient. I have two more quick questions, and we'll move on. One question from somebody online is, we have many part-time employees. Does the PPP apply to part-time employees? Steve, can you address that?
Yeah, it does, in that for purposes of counting your employees, that 500 number includes both full and part-time. They don't draw a distinction there. Your payroll costs for purposes of the benchmarks and forgiveness will therefore include wages paid to part-time employees. So I think the short answer is yes. I know it's not your question, Bob. I think some folks are scratching their head about how that might apply to those on a 1099. and it's a fair question. And I think our initial guidance is that it doesn't extend that far, and it may be the purpose of another discussion, but I would be leery about submitting for reimbursement on behalf of folks who are not your W-2 people for a host of other misclassification reasons.
Okay, good. And real quick, one more. What, if any, actions can a business take if their payroll grew over time? For example, we were in a startup mode in early 2019 during the review period, but by late 2019, we had more staff and a larger payroll. So I guess it's just look at the timing and the specifics for that company.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's a lot of math involved in that, but maybe there's good news there. If the concern is that they'll be unfairly judged because of the spike in their growth over that benchmark period, remember it's average monthly payroll over the aggregate of that benchmark period. So they will, if the facts as I'm hearing them suggest that they were very small in the early part of the benchmark period and grew at the later ends, at least the math will factor all of that in. I suppose though, if during that period they had an anomaly, they had an abnormally large payroll for the duration of the benchmark, which could happen, then I think there's going to be challenges for businesses there. Perhaps they can opt into the later period and argue that's more representative. And I imagine there's going to be some counsel that moves in that direction. But unfortunately, we are saddled with relatively tight time frames.
Right. Okay, good. All right, now we're going to move on to the banking questions. And I know there are a lot more questions we could ask on the legislation and the HR side. But this just gives you an idea of what questions you need to be asking when you meet with your financial advisors or legal advisors. But our first question for our banking panel, can you provide a quick executive summary of the CARES Act legislation? I'm going to throw that to both Bill and Rita. Rita, why don't you go first on that one?
Okay, well, first of all, let me share that things are changing daily. And I was on this morning with the OCC, I've been on with the Federal Reserve and the FDIC, and Treasury is going to put out some additional rulings this afternoon and tomorrow. So as you heard earlier, things are changing. But let me go over quickly, first of all, the small business paycheck protection, and then we'll talk about the economic injury or economic injury disaster loan too, so you will know a little bit about both. Both David and Steve have answered quite a number of good questions, but as an overall, the program itself for small businesses with funds to pay up to 8 weeks of payroll costs, but we need to remember in those benefits, they can also be used for interest on mortgages, rents, and utilities. And the funds are provided in the form of a loan, but this will be fully forgiven when used for payroll cost or what I mentioned earlier. Now, we are saying that due to likely high subscription of this, we feel like it's going to be quite a few people that are going to be applying. 75% of this forgiven amount must be used for payroll. So loan payments also will be deferred for 6 months that we talked about earlier, and then no collateral or personal guarantees are required. Neither the government nor the lenders will charge small businesses fees for this. Now, starting April the 3rd, is the small business and sole proprietorship can apply for the loan, and starting April the 10th, the independent contractors will be able to, and self-employed individuals applying. We, as bankers, encourage you to go ahead, even if you don't need the funds right now, to go ahead and get everything in line to be able to apply. And how do you apply? You can apply through any existing SBA 7A lender. That can be your own lender, or if they do not do that, on the Tampa Chamber's website, we will have where you can go for those particular lenders. You can also, I always hate to say this, it breaks my heart when I say federally insured credit unions can also have this ability along with farm credit system institutions. Other regulated lenders will be available to make the loans, but I always recommend consult first with your own banker and see how they would like for you to go with this. It's a very simple application, it's 2 pages, and then your own banker will want you to give them a little bit additional information, which you're going to need. But again, it's very, they're making it very simple for the businesses to be able to apply.
Okay, Bill, anything you'd like to add on that?
No, I think Rita gave a great high-level overview.
Okay, terrific. Bill, where can we find the guidelines to qualify and apply?
So I would, what you said earlier, directing everybody back to the Tampa Bay Chamber website, the links there, the U.S. Treasury Department, the SBA are constantly updating this. You talked about how legislation then process, they are updating it constantly. Going directly to those links is a great source of information. I would encourage everybody to do that. And I would also encourage, the SBA will be approving these loans. The conduit to there, as Rita mentioned, is the SBA certified lender. So going through an institution that will take that application, it'll be going to the SBA. Reach out to your specific bank because the method with which that bank may be accepting the application may vary. So have that dialogue with someone from your financial institution to talk about how that application is being paid and submitted to the SBA. So I would be doing that as well. But constantly go look to the website, the Tampa Bay Chamber's website, because it is, as both Steve and David and Rita said, it is changing constantly, and I suspect it'll continue to update and refresh throughout the day to day.
Very good. So Bill mentioned the SBA. Rita, are all these loans going through the normal SBA requirements? And can you just give a quick overview of what we know today of the application process?
Right. No, it's a very, like I said, it's a 2-page application now, and then your bank may require you, which I'm sure they will, a little bit more information that they want along with the compliance regulation detail to sign off on that. And then if you're a preferred lender, the bank itself will have the ability, if you're a preferred SBA lender, to go ahead and make that loan. Others will be going through the SBA, as Bill mentioned. Now, timing, Bob, we still don't know what that timing is going to look like, and we're waiting for, because you're ending up, the bank needs to get a number back from the SBA to be able to proceed, and we don't know what that process is going to look like or how long it's going to take. But tomorrow, I'm sure we'll fill that, because I'm sure a number of banks will go ahead and begin entering their very first loans to be processed, and then we can be able to give a better time frame to you probably sometime next week.
Okay.
Yeah, and Bob,
go ahead, Bill.
To add to that piece of it, the complete, if you go to the Treasury, there is a sample of what the application will look like. And I think it's important, if you're applying for this, the completeness of the application is be critical. As Rita said, we don't have a guideline in terms of when application, when approval, and when funding will actually take place and what that timeline will look like. But the completeness of the application will be important. In terms of providing the information. Much of that Steve had already outlined earlier in the call about what you need to be getting together, but the completeness of the information that will be needed, and then making sure you're answering all the questions, or you have the answers to the questions that are on the application. Getting it in completed and accurate the first time will certainly help with the timeliness of getting a response back.
So the investment of time up front to make sure your application is thorough and complete and has all the backup information it needs is more important than get something in right away and have it go back and forth with government application receivers. So take the time with your advisors to get that information together. So Rita, what is the economic injury disaster loan process and what's covered under that one?
Okay, so that actually will begin a little bit later. I believe I shared with you April the 10th, and it's for payroll, fixed debts, accounts payable, and other expenses that can be paid because of the impact that this has had on you. And it can be up to $2 million. Small businesses, it's the interest rate is 3.75. For nonprofits that Steve mentioned earlier, it's 2.75. And we feel like that this will be another help. Again, some more information will be forthcoming on this that we'll be able to put out on the website. But those are the two programs under the CARES Act that Steve and David mentioned to us earlier. And that's a little bit of the initiative that's needing. And Bill might have some other information on that too.
Okay. Bill, anything to add on that, Bill? Okay. All right.
No.
Now we've got a list of questions that are kind of toss-up. Anybody's comfortable answering this. How does the CARES Act apply to nonprofits, 501c3 organizations that are helping in our community? Bill, can you take that one?
Sure. Again, our understanding is for-profit and not-for-profit, there will be opportunities. And again, this goes back to what we said is, the process is still being formalized, but our understanding is that there will be opportunities for and not-for-profits to apply.
Okay,
Yep.
good.
Bob, this is
Go ahead, David.
I'll jump in because this was one policy provision, and to Bill's point, they expanded some of the traditional Small Business Administration loan products to specifically qualify nonprofits in this case. And so there are more generous provisions that include nonprofits in these programs. The area where you would see the limitation is in some of the employer incentive programs that operate by tax credits, where nonprofits don't have that taxable burden. Clearly, they're not going to qualify for a tax credit. And to be fair, that's a tough policy area right now where we may end up having to see a fix, because there are some nonprofits who are seeing disruption, but if they don't specifically qualify under some of these SBA provisions, they're left out simply because they don't have a taxable burden. That is an area that we as a legal and policy community are beginning to digest, but it is important to note that this bill does roll in nonprofits in a way they haven't been rolled in to qualify them for some of these programs.
And with the Tampa Bay Chamber and all of our partners working with us in this seminar, we are 501c6 not-for-profit organizations that have not been included in the stimulus and in the packages, and we're hoping to be included in future legislation as we work hard to keep our members working and succeeding. Had to put that plug in. Okay, David, can you answer this question on the economic disaster injury relief of the $10,000 grant? Are there any specific conditions placed on how that money is spent once it's received?
I don't believe there are. Now, this is very specific qualifying criteria, which is that your business was closed as a result of government order, or you can show based on this time last year a drop of 50% in your revenue. If that's the case, you qualify for, the way the language is written, a 50% tax credit up to $10,000 in payroll per employee. So essentially $5,000 per employee, and you receive that tax credit against your obligated payroll taxes. But should your newly eligible tax credit exceed your payroll tax burden, you do get it in the form of a tax refund. You are made whole on a full $5,000 per employee if you qualify under the specific distressed business that they're trying to target for this. Unlike the PPP program where virtually anybody qualifies, the $5,000 tax credit has to be for a company that has suffered clear disruption.
Okay, and they can apply, if they receive cash, they can apply that as they see fit to keep their business operating, correct?
It is a tax credit. So just like you would
okay.
receive a tax credit or refund, it's the eligibility that they look like. And if you qualify, you receive the tax credit.
Okay. To Bill and Rita, what additional information does someone need to have ready to give to their bank? What other information would you recommend?
Well, one of the things, of course, you're going to need your, your financial up-to-date records for your business, so that you'll have those. And then, of course, you're going to need your payroll so that we'll be able to see that payroll information as we move forward also. Bill, I don't know what else you may be requiring.
I think the guidance we have right now is that's it to this point of it, is documenting how you're getting the initial loan. And then after that, it's gonna be critical. I think Steve mentioned this and Dave mentioned is retaining the records to show as you're going to look for the forgiveness piece of it, retaining that information in terms of what those expenses were that you incurred on the actual payroll, rents, the interest, interest on other payments that were made, saving that and being able to prove that is going to be very, very important when it comes time to apply for the forgiveness portion of the initial loan.
And one other thing, Bob, is that
Sure.
although the program is open only till June the 30th, we're encouraging clients and potential clients to apply as quickly as possible because of the fact that there are funding caps and the lenders are going to need to be able to have time to process. So when you see that date, you still need to go ahead if you feel like you're going to apply to get everything ready to do so.
Okay, good. This is a little more technical question. If a business has a self-funded healthcare plan, do they include those numbers in their claim on their loan application? That's a tricky question. Who'd like to take that one?
I would say Steve.
Okay. Steve, what do you think?
I was really afraid you'd say that, Rita. So I'm just going through the list now, and one thing I see among the list of payroll costs, and remember, payroll costs comes into place in two ways. It factors into your loan amount, and that, of course, factors into the forgiveness piece on the other side. And I see a reference to payment required for provisions of group health care benefits, including insurance premiums. So I would see that as good news for folks who might otherwise be concerned that, you know, the wage costs alone won't get them there. You know, the more I read through this and their definition of payroll costs, the more it seems clear to me that Congress, to their credit, I think, really went out of their way to be all-encompassing with that term.
Okay, very good. So next question, this is in relation to the faith-based community. Will churches who had to close their doors and suspend their services receive any relief from the stimulus package? David, can you answer that one?
I have not seen a specific provision for that. And depending on how they're formed, perhaps there would be a loan forgiveness available. They might qualify under the PPP program, but I think getting at the root of the question, I don't think there's going to be income replacement for that, for that based organization.
Okay, good, thank you.
And Bob, I agree with that. However, if there's a school attached to that that church, then I do believe that there is ability for the school.
Okay.
David or Steve can, I mean, yeah, they can help me with that, but I believe that's my understanding for right now.
That makes intuitive sense to me, Rita, and I guess it illustrates David's point that you really have to kind of dig a little deeper beneath the surface to see how the business itself is structured.
Good. And our next question, a manufacturing company, they have leased machines. Would that be covered as part of the rent or a lease as they're applying for relief in the different programs? Bill, can you address that one?
So my understanding, again, is that when it refers to rent and lease, it's referring to what would be your rent and lease obligation for your occupancy. Again, you know, a giant disclaimer is, you know, I only know what we've seen so far, but on your if you have a mortgage payment, it's the interest portion, not the principal portion of that piece that would be at this point eligible. But when I think when it refers to rent and lease, it is referring to what would be a occupancy piece, not a actual lease obligation. David, you may have more information on that.
No, I would generally agree with that, but I would offer to Rita and Bill and Steve, that probably is an eligible expense under the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program. That would be covered under that program if you wish to look into that product.
Good point.
Okay, good. This is a more technical question. An employer asked, they had to let 2 employees go for non-COVID-19 related issues, and since everything has slowed down, they had not hired anyone to take their place. How will that affect them with the payroll protection program? Steve, can you address that?
Yeah, it potentially has an impact, which could be offset if those individuals end up getting reinstated over the 8-week period following loan origination. But the short answer is that the snapshot that's crucial is that 8-week period after loan origination relative to one of the 2 benchmark periods we covered before. So it's a little hard to answer on those facts, but I think to me the emphasis is on it's not too late to make up for any potential shortfall. And you know, it probably can't be said enough that clearly that's what Uncle Sam is really pushing borrowers to do. I mean, they're making no bones of the fact that if you're in a position to reinstate those folks, even if it's for purposes of performing telework, then they're incentivizing you to do just that.
Okay. All right, very good. Another question posted online regarding the $100,000 cap on wages. Should we be including health insurance premiums and retirement costs for those over $100,000 employees? Rita, can you address that one?
So it's my understanding, and again, Steve can help me here, that employee benefits, including costs for vacation, parental, family, medical, or sick leave, allowances for separation or dismissal, and payments required for these provisions, healthcare, including insurance and retirement, would count in the payroll cost.
Okay, good. Real quick, because we are starting to get close to time, I'm going to call on each of you to give a website address where people can refer to more information. Steve, we'll start with you. Where would you refer people to if they want to get more information online?
Well, I would steer them first to the Greater Tampa, well, that Tampa Chamber website. Shame on me first, but I think that, you know, the resources you guys have been accumulating, I will give you guys credit because you're updating it regularly, and there's some good stuff there. I would particularly refer those out there to the U.S. Chamber materials, and I'll even give them a free plug because I'm holding up one of the documents that they came out early with, and I really liked it. Had graphics that were user friendly, and I think this stuff can get really confusing really quickly. Our firm, Phillips, is putting up a lot of materials, updating regularly. David, his firm at Shumaker, is doing an outstanding job. A lot of law firms and banking institutions are out there doing terrific work, but I keep referring people first back to websites that Treasury and SBA are putting out.
Good. Okay, Rita?
I agree with the Tampa Bay Chamber website as the first one. Also, your SBA, and for bankers, the ABA website, aba.com, they have some excellent materials, and they're pretty up to date on what the Treasury's saying also. So those would be the three, along with your bank. Your bank's going to have I would assume most of them have something along this line that's going to help them to make it really quick and easy for them to apply.
Good. Bill?
Yeah, exactly what Stephen and Rita said. What I would put out there is kind of a word of caution of where not to go. You know, be very wary of the emails that you may get from parties and senders that you're not familiar with, that will help you navigate this process and help you get money and help you apply. And all you need is to send them some information on your company and your payroll and your tax ID number. You hate to say that, but you know, everybody on this line and the other attorneys and CPAs and bankers in our community are trying to help everybody who's listening to this, but that's not the case with everyone. So be very, very careful of an email that's coming to you that's offering you something that's probably too good to be true. As you all know, if it usually sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And so be very weary of that part, I would say.
Very good advice. And the governor's office talked about that, how the state is watching and trying to catch as many of the bad actors as possible. Be sure you are 100% sure who you are communicating with. And if you get an email, talk to them on the phone before you send anything back if they're asking for personal information. Very important that we all take care of protecting our information as we work through this process. It's a good advice, Bill. David, where would you refer people to?
I would concur with many of the panelists. From the government perspective, the Small Business Administration has been working very quickly. You know, we know government can take a long time, but they understand the urgency. There's a surge of resources. They're trying to be as clear as possible. At the Small Business Administration website, there is a link at the very top. As was mentioned, Steve mentioned, and thank you for the shout out to Shumaker. Check if you're associated with a law firm, see what they are currently doing. At Shumaker.com and ShumakerAdvisors.com, we've got a task force that's trying to put as much information out as possible. But honestly, a lot of law firms are, and just get on the web and look at some of these law firms. because we all, excuse me, digest this just a little differently. And you'll get a lot of information by looking at some of the competing information products. Obviously, your bank website, as Rita said. And I would also offer one last word of advice, both in where to look, but also how to think about this current problem. The bill did try to address gig employees and contractors and so forth in more generous ways than in the past. And I know there were some questions about how those employees are counted on the employer side, but if you're a gig employee or a contractor or a small business owner, you may also look at the employee side at the new unemployment insurance benefits. And I know we don't like to go to that resort, but there are new benefits for gig employees and contractors now qualified under the unemployment insurance program, even if you may not have paid into it before. So I would offer that as a destination to look to as well for some people. Look at the employee side products offered through the state unemployment insurance program. The Tampa Bay Times this morning on their website, I don't know if it's in print, actually had a Q&A on the new state unemployment insurance program. You could look there as well.
Perfect. And one more great question has come in. I'm going to ask this as our last question. And well, this will be a toss-up if somebody can take it. What advice do you have for employers, especially manufacturers, regarding federal, state, and local mandates and orders that aren't on the same page? Some businesses need help understanding how to comply. Which mandate or order should they make a priority without jeopardizing eligibility for new relief programs that are being rolled out?
Bob, I can take a quick stab
Sure.
at that and invite others to comment too, but there's two things that jump out at me that might be at odds with one another. Number one, I mean, from the legal perspective, there's a very loose rule of thumb that the feds should preempt the states, which should preempt the municipalities. And we saw that firsthand with the stay at place order. And I feel the pain of whoever asked that question, because these things are not working hand in glove the way you'd like them to. They're being issued at light speed in a very reactive mode. But because they are, another thing I think we're learning, all of us on the fly, is that sometimes just waiting, even a couple hours, the clarification comes. I mean, an example is right here in Tallahassee right now. We're all scratching our heads because the governor issued an order that is directed at senior citizens without any attempt to define what that means. I'd like to believe that we'll get clarification on that. And what we keep learning is that if you're confused about something, you're probably not the only one. Those agencies are getting questions, and to their credit, they're doing the best they can. And we are starting to see results, even if it's a day later. So if you can, and you have the luxury of time, give it a little while and see what comes down the pike.
Perfect. Great answer. Go ahead, David. Do you want to add on to that real quick?
I would add on to that. The safer at home orders and the closed business orders are a function largely now of local and state edict, and the federal guidance that is generally looked to as Department of Homeland Security, and one of the last provisions says, but do this in coordination with your local providers. Importantly, law enforcement that is actually enforcing any of these provisions is a function of your local or municipal authority. So look to that. And I would finally offer, document whatever processes you are making within your business to keep your employees safe. There is an entire insurance question that will be coming on all of this. And it's important to document what you did as an employer to keep your employees safe during this time, as well as possibly how you handle this responsibly when it comes to questions of business interruption.
Good counsel. Thank you very much, David. And again, you've heard the resources to go to online. I also want to refer everyone to tampabaychamber.com. That's tampabaychamber.com for many links referenced previously with our speakers, as well as the references that they provided to you. This is the latest we know as of Thursday, April 2nd, 2020, on what's happening with the legislation. Also, I want to tell everyone that next week, the U.S. Chamber and Bill Goede and Rita Lowman will be back for a look further into the financial aspects of the CARES Act. It will be held on Thursday of next week, which is the 9th. The registration opens up just a little while later today. I want to thank all of our panelists. You've been fantastic, great information. It's a lot to absorb, and I encourage everyone, this will be posted later. Go back and look at it again if that will help. So thank you, Steve. Thank you, Rita. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, David. And I also want to thank all of our partner chambers and business organizations for helping to spread the word and make this webinar a success. Everyone be safe, wash your hands, listen to the regulations, and be informed. Spend the time to get informed up front. Thank you all very much. Have a safe and happy day.